Eye of the Tiger. We start off again.
Do you know what? I've learnt something today. David's been saying about it being a Liverpool song. I didn't realise it was, actually.
Oh, right.
Yes, so
Yes.
something new.
Yes.
Among others.
Oh, welcome, David. David Jones.
It's very good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we've put you in the chair. Unknown to us, well, we do know there's one chair that's a bit dodgy, and it keeps dropping down and down.
Yes.
David's like
and
this.
that happens to be mine, and I'm really grateful to Andrea for dropping her chair down to my level.
I just hope we don't go any further. David.
Self-conscious.
Yeah. So yeah, we're at this level. I think we need to talk about new furniture, maybe.
I think we do. I think we do.
Let's look at the budget.
The budget.
Thanks for coming in today.
No, you're welcome. It's good to be here.
It's interesting to get so many different candidates in, actually, and just have that hour with each one, just have a quick chat about what the party's about that they're representing, but about yourself as well. So what we've been doing, David, is just having a chat with each one, and the first half an hour is about yourself, really, and about the Conservative Party policies. So you're Clwyd West, aren't you?
Yes, I'm the Conservative candidate for Clwyd West, and I was the Conservative MP for Clwyd West until Parliament was dissolved a couple of weeks ago.
And that's something that I learnt new recently, actually, because once Parliament's dissolved, you're no longer a standing MP.
No, there are no MPs during election periods, so you can't represent yourself as being one, and you're just another candidate.
Yes. So how long have you been living in Clwyd West? You do live in Clwyd West, don't you?
Yes, I've been the MP for Clwyd West for almost 15 years. I was elected in 2005. I live in the constituency. I live in Rows-on-Sea with my wife, and I've lived in this part of the world for over 40 years.
Right. Okay. Okay. So so you're not you're not born in Wales?
No, I was born in London. Both my parents were Welsh, but my father was working in London, and I was born in London. I was actually born in the London Hospital, which is within the sound of Bow Bells.
Oh, right.
So that makes me a Cockney.
So you're a Cockney.
There are very few Welsh Cockneys about.
Yes.
But we moved back to North Wales when I was about 2, and I lived here since then. I was brought up in the Wrexham area. I went to school in Rwabon, and then after that, after I qualified as a solicitor, I moved to North Wales, and I've practiced here and lived here ever since.
So, as a sitting MP, when you're in Parliament and before it's dissolved, you do actually practice as well as a solicitor, then?
No, I don't.
No.
I practiced in Llandudno, but when I became an MP, I ceased practicing. My office is still there, and my old colleagues are still there, but you can't really do 2 jobs. It's a very demanding job being an MP.
Full time.
You simply can't. You can't moonlight.
Do you miss it then, being an MP?
No, do I miss being an MP?
So, do you miss being an MP and a lawyer?
I certainly miss being an MP, which is why I want to be an MP again. But no, I think that once you become an MP, you realise it's such an interesting occupation that it would be very difficult to go back to anything else, I think.
So what attracted you to being an MP then? Why did you stand initially?
Well, I've always been interested in politics, but I remember when I was 9 years old, I went to London with my father, and in those days you could just walk into the Palace of Westminster. Nowadays you have to go through several ranks of police officers, but in those days you could just walk in and visit it. And he took me around this building, and I thought, wow. I think anybody who visits it is immediately overwhelmed by the building, apart from anything else. But I just had a feeling from a very early age I wanted to be an MP. I always took a huge interest in politics. I became an activist when I was 18 at university, and it continued from there.
Okay, yeah. Which university did you go to?
I was at University College London,
in London,
where I studied law.
Okay.
Did you always want to sort of help people or do things in
Yes, I think so. I think that's really part of, obviously, the biggest part of the job. And I think to that extent it's really useful to be a lawyer, because a lot of the issues that people raise with you are not necessarily legal issues, but there are legal implications to the matters that they raise. So it's really useful to be a lawyer, and I think the law is the single profession which is most represented in the House of Commons.
And it is actually a way of thinking as well, isn't it? It's a way of thinking and getting down to problems and resolving them.
Yes, it is. And of course, the other point is that you're making law. So
Yes.
if you actually understand the law, it's a lot easier to consider the implications of the bills that come before you, which you're being asked to approve.
Yes.
Yeah, talking about the bills, actually, lots of people that I speak to talk about the mess that's been going on in Parliament, and they don't understand necessarily why certain policies can't be implemented. And we will talk about Brexit anyway, because that's one of the big issues, not one of the only issues, but it's a big issue for
Certainly
people,
the
isn't it?
biggest issue of this election.
But it's that without a majority government, then you can't actually get a policy through Parliament unless you get support from the opposition. That's how it works, isn't it?
Yeah, and the difference here, I mean, that's quite right. And of course, we had a minority government, you'll remember, in 2010, where we had to have a coalition. But the difference here is that Brexit, which is the issue that's triggered this election, was an issue that had already been put to the people. There was a vote in Parliament to give the people a referendum, and of course the people voted by a majority of over 1 million to leave the EU. But of course the difficulty is that you have a different opinion in Parliament, and of course the majority of MPs wanted us to remain. And that, of course, was MPs on the Conservative, some MPs on the Conservative side, as well as a lot of MPs on the opposition side.
It's cross-party, wasn't it? Yeah.
So that's why, inevitably we had to have an election. And what was quite interesting, of course, was we had 3 separate attempts under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act to have an election, but of course we couldn't get the 2/3 majority that you need under that act to call an election. So ultimately we had to go through this very strange device of putting effectively a one-line bill through to get the election. And of course we ultimately got it. But it was a difficult process.
Presumably that's about you wanting to go down a certain path with Brexit. And presumably people before didn't agree with that path. I mean, ultimately they did agree to go and consider it. But it's been a tortuous route, hasn't it?
I think that the big problem is this. Parliament passed the issue of whether we should leave the EU to the people by way of a referendum, and an Act of Parliament went through permitting the referendum. The people had the decision, if you like, devolved or transferred to them. And then I think that people cannot understand, and we come back to this point about people being confused about what's going on. People can't understand why, having voted for a certain course, which is to leave the EU, Parliament was then not permitting that course to be followed. And it's caused an awful lot of bad blood. And in fact, I've been on the doorstep here in Kimble Bay just before coming here. And that was the issue that I was getting raised repeatedly. We can't understand why we haven't left the EU when we voted for it, and you told us that you'd take us out.
I think it's an issue that is talked about quite a lot. We've talked about it quite a lot on the show, and it is the fact that we haven't had a majority government, that it's not been able to be passed through Parliament. The country is split, isn't it? If you look at the gap between the amount that voted to leave and the amount that voted to remain, that is quite
52 to 48%.
It's very
close.
close, and that's caused this massive split in the country and in Parliament. So I'm hoping, and I'm sure everybody else is hoping, that we get a majority government.
Yes.
If we don't get, it's likely that we could possibly be looking at another coalition, I think. That's my personal opinion. Because of all the different parties and because of the different messages from the different parties, I think there's going to be a split again.
Well, I think that really there is only one major party that is now wholly committed to leaving the EU, which is obviously the Conservative Party. There is the Brexit Party.
I was going to say the Brexit
But
Party.
the Brexit Party, of course, is not standing in my constituency of Clwyd West, it's standing in Vale of Clwyd. But of course, around half of the Brexit Party candidates have actually been stood down by Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
So it's clear that the Brexit Party is not going to win the next election, and therefore I think that if there were to be a coalition, there'd be a possibility of a coalition of the parties who were in opposition the last time round, which raises all sorts of further interesting questions about how you form a coalition of what are otherwise a pretty disparate number of parties.
Just moving on from Brexit, because I think we'll return to it at some point.
Yeah,
but I think that just thinking about you to start with, and your voting record, you seem to have been consistently against the European Union over your time. From what I've got here, you've voted a lot against gay rights, and you've voted a lot against equality.
I voted against same-sex marriage.
Okay.
And really, I think that is the only vote. And that was because I've got religious beliefs. I always took the view then that marriage was an institution that was for men and women. Of course, I actually I was on the losing side on that occasion. But I think it'd be fair to point out that I'm very much in favour, for example, of civil partnerships. I'm in favour of gay rights, absolutely. In fact, I've got some people who are very close to me who are gay, but as I say, I have religious convictions, and I did not believe that was an issue between two men or two women. I felt that it was one that for a man and a woman.
So your religious beliefs, they sort of follow you, and is the sort of fundamental principle, your guiding principle in terms of how you vote on certain issues?
Well, I think if you are a Christian, you sort of can't do it on a part-time basis. I mean, it's something that informs everything that you do.
Oh, that's right.
I have mostly Christian friends, but I have friends from different religious backgrounds, and their religion very much encompasses what they do in their life. And I think it's important for voters as well to understand their candidates and why they are committed in one way or another to one type of policy or not. I do think it's not... people find it more unacceptable now for people to be against the gay marriage, more so nowadays than what they were.
Well,
I think public perception is very much changing, isn't it?
I think that's a very fair point, and I don't actually think that at the moment it's an issue. And of course, the fact is it's the law.
It's legal,
and if it's the law, then you accept it.
It's legal now, isn't it? So,
yes.
and to myself, I think it should be. And I think the generation coming up now as well. We're definitely in a different era where the youngsters now are very, very active, and they're very looking into different rights. I mean, look at the climate change, the Extinction Rebellion people and other organisations that are actually rising up in regards to the climate change. What's your feelings about the climate, this big thing now?
Look, this is the defining issue of this generation, the issue of the potential for climate change. We may be witnessing at the moment. I think that anybody who actually looks at the issue has got to accept that climate change is real and that it's probably man-made. And in fact, a few years ago, I went to Chicago and visited the American National Laboratory there, the Argonne National Laboratory, and was given a presentation which made it very clear to me that over the last 100 years or so, carbon emissions had really accelerated, and the temperature of the planet had increased. And you know, we do need to take this extremely seriously. The government has a policy to become carbon neutral by 2050, which is actually the most ambitious target of any government in the world.
This is in the manifesto now. So the Conservative Party manifesto came out a couple of days ago.
It was actually government policy beforehand. I mean, you know, the Parliament has voted.
Carbon neutral by... I mean, we had someone in yesterday who was saying their policy was to go 2030.
I think that was Pete. Was that Peter with the Brexit Party?
I think you've got to be led by science and by experts, and the Independent Committee on Climate Change has actually advised that 2030 is probably not attainable realistically, but that 2050 is. And I think that we should be guided by science, and to that extent, you know, I think that the commitment is a very ambitious one, and it's something, of course, that can't be isolated to this country. It's a global issue. I think if you look at China, for example, which has got a huge number of fossil fuel burning power stations, and which is rapidly industrializing to the extent that very shortly become the biggest economy in the world, we can't do anything unless we've got China on board, the United States
India
on board, and so on. But what we can do, of course, in this country is to be an exemplar. And you know, we're a significantly important country. We're on the Security Council as a permanent member of the United Nations. We can exercise a lot of influence, and that's what we should be doing.
Wales is leading actually in some of the recycling and some of the policies around. You know,
I think so. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me, and it goes back to a little about Brexit, is that one of the things that we can do is trade with certain countries and not trade with them as we move forward. Would you consider not trading with certain countries that were polluting, like China?
Well, you've got to be careful because, of course, China is a member of the World Trade Organization, as are we. And, you know, there are rules of the WTO which, you know, require countries who are members to trade with one another.
So we're going from Europe in one set of rules into WTO with another set of rules?
No, not at all. I mean, each individual country has got its own rules. But, I mean, I think the point you were making was about the potential of boycotting other countries.
Yes.
Well, I don't think that any country could boycott another country ad lib. I think that, you know, sanctions and so on, boycotts are something
America and Iran
have to be done. Yeah, but they really have to be done collectively. I mean, it's a different issue. I mean, the issue is one of pollution. The issue is one of a worldwide effort to reduce the extent of carbon emissions, and I think to that extent it's far better to do something voluntarily rather than try to penalise people.
Are China actually engaging in this then?
They are, to be fair. China actually are looking at some really quite innovative ways of reducing carbon emissions. So, I mean, it would be wrong and unfair to say that they were polluting ad lib. The problem that we've got, of course, is that China has industrialised only relatively recently, and they've been using...
I mean, we've come out of that, haven't we, in the UK?
We're actually moving on to an era where we're producing lower carbon emissions. And actually, this country is doing a lot. I mean, for example, in terms of green energy, battery technology, we're world leaders, and these are opportunities for this country post-Brexit.
We're doing a lot, aren't we, really? And I think we are leading in a lot of ways. And I think people's perceptions, again, are changing, and people are becoming more knowledgeable in their own activities and how they are recycling.
I think there's no doubt about that.
I
think the big worry, however, is that you know, we have recently tended to export our problem of pollution. So, for example, when people think that they're recycling, it's actually going somewhere to the Far East, where they may be incinerated or disposed of in the oceans. So I think that we need to be... there's no question. Yeah.
See, I thought that they were actually getting reused, the plastics were actually getting reused where they could, and they were actually being made into different products as well.
Oh, some
for
certainly
reuse.
are. I mean,
chairs, for
there's a
example,
very innovative company in Bottle Witham, for example, which does exactly that.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you actually consider the extent to which we consume plastics every day, you go to your supermarket, you'll get something wrapped in plastic.
Yeah.
Not all of that is being recycled. A lot of that is actually being shipped out to the third world, where it actually pollutes these countries. And we have to stop that process. We have to make sure that countries who do reprocess our waste are doing it in a way that is
Would you
really
be in
responsible.
favour of actually additionally pricing those
Oh,
companies
right.
that do
Yeah.
put packaging around?
I think
There's
it
other
should be
countries.
barred altogether. I think it should be barred.
I think that there should be disincentives from using plastics, and I think there should be incentives for using recyclable materials. And it was quite interesting. I went to a supermarket the other day where they don't sell anything in packaging. You have to go along there with your own container and take it away. And I thought that was really
Sounds
good.
really
So
good.
if you believe these things, and the policy of the Conservative Party, it's been in power for about 9 years now, so why hasn't it done anything
Well,
about
actually,
these things?
it has done a lot. And in fact, again, if we go back to the manifesto, I mean, I was just talking a moment ago about the issue of exporting our waste. One of the policies in the manifesto is that we will not export any waste to any country that is not able to deal with it to our satisfaction. So, in other words, it'll be countries who actually comply with our standards.
So
and I think that's
there
important.
is a standards. There's a set of standards that these countries need to
Yes.
adhere to for the UK to then send their waste over.
There are, and you know, I think that anybody who saw David Attenborough's Blue Planet programme will have seen the impact on the Indian Ocean of plastic waste.
Terrible.
And I read only last week that particles of plastics are actually being now found in fish in the Antarctic.
Yeah, I've heard things like this as well. But I personally think as well, why doesn't the government have a policy where they're saying that by a certain time these companies can no longer package their products in plastic? I
think there is a way to go in that direction. I think one of the things you have to do is to decide what sort of containers are acceptable. I mean, for example, you tend to think automatically that paper bags are environmentally friendly because they biodegrade, but a lot of them are treated with chemicals.
Yes, they've got plastics on them.
Exactly, which are polluting. I mean, the prime example, of course, is if you go to one of the chain coffee shops and get a cup of coffee and you get in a paper cup and you think that is recyclable. It's not.
No.
So I think
I've got my own cup. I carry my own cup around, and I have.
And I think, you know, a lot of coffee
Take that
shops
with
are
me.
now actually encouraging people to go
To do
in,
that.
and of course they give them a reduction. So that's an example of what you were talking a moment ago about actually giving people incentives for polluting less.
Yeah, because I think as individuals, we are taking on board very much, you know, what's going on, and we're being more conscious about how we behave and how we use plastics and how we buy our products. But I do feel that initiative from the government is not there to prevent the big companies from continuously producing these plastics.
Well,
I don't know if there's any policy in place to
Well,
prevent
yes,
that.
you know, I mean, the prime one, which has been adopted all across the country, it started in Wales, was the issue of reusable plastic bags in supermarkets. And, you know, now you're used to the
that's
fact
one policy,
that
isn't it?
you
Yeah.
will actually buy a plastic bag that you will then take back and will be properly recycled when it wears out into a hole. So these things are happening. The problem is, of course, that we're now talking about, again, reversing a process that's been going on for about 60 or 70 years since plastics first started to be used. I think we need to accelerate the process. Obviously, the government has got a big role to play, but so do manufacturers, and so do, frankly, each individual. You know, I think that people need to think very carefully before they buy a product and think whether they want to buy something that's plastic.
I think they are.
Just moving on from that, and
Yes.
I don't disagree with anything you've said there. I mean, it's very.
I do think we need policy in place to prevent the manufacturers in the first place from producing these. I just don't feel that they're being held to account as much as individuals are.
I'd agree with that, but I think you have to decide.
Us, isn't it?
You have, but you also have to decide what is put in place of the plastics.
Of course,
And at the moment, sadly,
there isn't anything.
You know, you can't. You
There's
know,
got to be something.
your television set, you know, for example, is all plastic and metal, and it's very hard to see how you can make it otherwise.
I'm thinking particularly around your food shopping. I don't feel there's any need to have this massive amounts of plastic packaging.
Things are grossly over-packaged, and they're frequently packaged with things that are not easily recyclable.
Yeah. And I think policy, I think they need to be held to account, to be fair. The manufacturers of these do need to be held to account.
Just moving on, and that's great. Just moving on to another element of policy, and that's about benefits, and it's about how people are paid benefits when people can't work. Traditionally, there's been a whole big thing about universal credit that's been brought in by this government, and in your manifesto you're wanting to actually keep on with that. How do you see benefit claimants at present? There was a certain nastiness at the beginning when people were talked about as scroungers and all sorts of things when it first came in. That rhetoric seems to have died down now, but there's still benefits.
There was a lot of it, wasn't there?
There was a lot of it.
Well, I'm not sure where the rhetoric came from. I mean, I, for example, have never used that expression ever in my life, I deal regularly, obviously as part of my job, with people who are benefits claimants, and mostly they'd like to get back to work if they could. Not everybody can, and of course there are different types of benefits. Universal credit was actually introduced under Ian Duncan Smith when he was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and the idea of universal credit is effectively to give people their own income to enable them to go into work without finding it penal, and to ultimately come off benefits altogether. It was also intended to assist people in managing their own budgets, because Ian Duncan Smith felt, and I think a lot of people actually agree with him, that it is far better for people to manage their own budgets, to pay their own rent, and not to depend upon the state to do it for them. Now, there certainly have been some difficulties with universal credit, but it's by no means, the all-encompassing problem that sometimes you read about in the press.
So, do you think it's worked?
I think that there have certainly been teething troubles, and I think the government has recognised that by actually amending the policy as it goes on. But I think ultimately to ensure that people can have a safety net which they can come out of when they want to work and when they're able to find work, without actually finding that it's penal to go into work, which was the problem that we had before, is a good thing. I think it's a policy.
How do you mean it was would be penal for them to go into work then?
Because the way that the benefits were previously structured was that you came to sort of cliff edges in terms of the benefit, and once you earned a certain level, you would cease being entitled to certain types of benefit. So in other words, people were not finding an incentive to get back into work.
Financial incentive.
The advantage of universal credit is that it tapers. So, in other words, you don't find yourself at the cliff edge when you arrive at a certain income. You find that your benefit disappears or is significantly reduced. It reduces far more gradually, and that was the driving force behind you.
You see why that works, but I don't. I mean, we're in North Wales. We're in a high poverty area, aren't we?
Some parts of North Wales.
But some parts of North Wales were in a really high poverty area compared to the UK average, and European as well. Considering the European averages as well. And universal credit has had a really detrimental effect on the hardest to reach groups.
It can certainly have problems. I can see that quite readily. There have been problems.
But it needs reforming again, doesn't it?
Well, look, it has already been reformed, as I said. The government has reviewed it, and it needs constant review. But as do any benefits, if it comes to that. There's some very, very hard cases that I come across every day. In my job.
You voted against upping the levels for benefits, haven't you, over the years?
I voted in line with government policy on
and are you happy with that policy to keep benefits lower?
Well, I think that we need to give people every incentive they possibly can to get into work. I think the more people we have in work, the better we are as a society. At the moment, we've got record levels of employment, high levels of employment, and low levels of unemployment.
Do you know the problem with that, though, David, is that so many people, now just moving on to a little bit, another policy around work, is the zero-hour contract. So many companies are using the zero-hour contract options, and I do speak to people who have been employed in the zero-hour contract business, and they just can't afford to cover their basic utility bills, their rent or their mortgages. It's just not.
Well, I think that's true. That's not policy.
No, is it?
That is an arrangement that the individual companies do.
But we can have a policy to say that we don't have zero-hour contracts.
Well, if you don't do that, then you're denying people who would like to have zero-hour contracts the opportunity to have them. And ultimately, this is an individual choice between parties to a contract. What I think is wrong is if you, for example, were to get an exclusive zero-hours contract whereby the employee was not able to get a contract with anyone else. If somebody decides that he or she wants to take on a zero-hours contract, that's their business, but they should also have the opportunity.
They should have the opportunity
to go elsewhere. But for some people, I have to say, zero-hour contracts actually do suit them.
No doubt about that. I do agree with that. But what I don't agree with personally is that companies are allowed to actually not offer their employees a contract. That takes away so many people's rights, workers' rights, because they can't get holiday pay. That's a big one, actually. Paternity pay, maternity pay, all their rights are actually eroded under a zero-hour contract because they're not contracted, are they?
Well, they are contracted, but they're not contracted to any particular level of hours. I mean, I think that's the point. Look, there are obviously bad employers and there are good employers. Bad employers generally don't tend to stay in business for very long. Good employers don't do that sort of thing.
Okay. I think there are examples of somebody such as Amazon. They do have the zero-hour contracts. They're a massive employer, and they should be offering their employees contracts so that their rights are actually, adhered to. It's unfair with companies like that.
I think I have to say, in fairness to the employees, if the employees decide that a zero-hours contract actually suits them, then they should be able to do it.
There's no doubt about that.
I mean, ultimately, we have to obviously acknowledge that a contract of employment is a contract between two parties. And, the law should only be intervening where there is obvious and manifest exploitation. And to that extent, I would agree with you.
Yeah,
but
there is exploitation.
What I don't agree with you on is the suggestion that they should be banned altogether.
Because
I think that people have the right as adults to enter into whatever contract.
No, I don't agree. They should be banned altogether.
Just moving on a little bit in terms of just similar subject in that there has been a rise in inequality between the rich and the poor in this area, and we've got food banks where we never had them before. What's your feelings about that?
Food banks have been around quite a long time, I mean, again,
They've grown rapidly over the last
they
few
have,
years.
but I think that they've grown because the number of food banks have grown. In other words, I think that the number of people visiting food banks have grown because food banks have become such a regular feature of our country. But this is not something that grew up under the Conservative Party. This is something that was there under the last Labour government.
So how many packages would have been given out under the last Labour government
don't-
compared to now?
I haven't got the figures. You may have them.
But
No,
my
I'm just
issue was
looking at some
about
comments, sorry,
my
that are
issue
gonna
was
be coming
about inequality. Has that risen? I mean, we've got a greater national debt when the Conservatives come in to power. We've got a greater inequality between the rich and the poor now. And what's your feelings about that?
What we have got, as I say, is more people in employment than ever before.
Yes, but lower paid.
Well, no. I mean, people who are working quite clearly are people who want to work, and I would think that by and large, it's quite clear that they're doing better than people who are on benefit.
But some people are having to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And families aren't being families; they're actually just workhorses going out.
Well, the point is that we've had an economy that was badly affected as a consequence of the financial crash of 2008. That was devastating to a large number of companies in this country, and there was a consequent effect upon people who were employed by those companies. We've had a period where we've obviously had to retrench as a consequence of that.
But we've got greater national debt now.
Well, consider what we inherited back in...
No, we've got greater national debt than when you came into power.
Well, we clearly would, because, of course, we're having to cope with the consequences of the financial crash.
But I thought the austerity measures were put in place to actually to address that national debt.
And imagine what the level would have been if they hadn't been put in place. And, you know...
It hasn't addressed the national debt, though, has it?
Austerity is a relative term. I mean, austerity in this country is very, very different from the standards of living in many countries, not only around the world, but in Europe itself.
I think, to be fair, that with the UK in particular, working people, or, you know, the average man, woman on the street, have actually fought to get the standards that they've got today, haven't they? You know, the suffragettes, they fought for the vote, and going back to the working communities in the 1800s, they fought for their vote and they fought for human rights, and so we have fought for that. Our country's fought for these rights, and a right to live at a certain level, and unfortunately, and the UN rapporteur came out with that report. I don't know if you agree with the report or not, about 14 million people living in poverty in the UK.
There's no doubt that there is too much poverty. Look, the fact is that any level...
There's no need for that, is there?
Well, any level of poverty at all is obviously entirely unacceptable. But you need to address it. And I think that the best way to address poverty is to have as much employment as possible and to give people the opportunity to work.
What happens if people can't work? Because questions coming in and about people having to choose between putting the heating on or eating. This is in this area, in a developed country, highly developed country, where we've got rich people becoming richer and poor people becoming poorer. So,
well,
that's the legacy, is it not?
What I don't think you do, actually, is to solve the problems of poverty by trying to penalise wealth creators.
I wasn't suggesting that at all.
But that seemed to be the influence I was taking.
No, I wasn't suggesting that at all.
The fact is that people who are entrepreneurial will become richer, and this is a state of affairs that has prevailed since civilization began. I think what we need to do as a decent society is to make sure that there is a minimum level of income for people in this country.
Are you in favour of an income, sort of basic income for everyone?
Well, that's why, for example, we've raised the national living wage, and the national living wage has gone up considerably. That's why we have increased the threshold at which people start paying tax, so people don't pay any tax below.
But nothing
the level of
massive,
12,000.
nothing massive.
Well, I mean, frankly, it's a lot better, without wanting to be overtly political, than it was under the last Labour government.
But the Conservatives...
Well, sorry, I mean, if I can just finish
Sorry,
the point.
yes,
The point I'm making is that people don't pay any tax at all under 12,500 per annum. We are increasing the level at which people start to pay national insurance contributions to 9,500. That will ultimately go up to 12,500. But you can only do all this if you have a vibrant economy where where the economy as a whole is employing more people. And, you know, that is the way it's got to work.
No.
It certainly won't work with the sort of quasi-Marxist system that Jeremy Corbyn
We
is
don't want to go into
suggesting.
others. Just
Forgive me.
it's what about you can do.
But we are in an election. So.
I agree. But it's easy to comment about.
Have done it, I think.
Yeah, we try and keep people away.
Sorry, forgive me. Okay, I can't talk about it.
It's about what you can do. Moving it on, because we've got about 12 minutes left.
I think as well with our Labour candidates we will have to say the same.
We will be saying the same.
I think it's about the candidates, but I think about the Conservative
It's about
policies.
you and it's about the area and it's about your policies.
And time's moving on, isn't it? It's gone quick.
It's
Nearly
about
an
12
hour
minutes
already.
left. NHS, been promised on the manifesto that there's going to be loads more nurses because they're all waiting there just to suddenly jump into jobs.
No, that with respect is being deliberately fatuous, and I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, I'm sure I would,
So
yes.
is it 50,000 in the manifesto? There's 50,000 expected.
50,000
recruitment of new nurses.
There will be 50,000 more nurses in the system in England. Bear in mind that in Wales, of course, it's a different.
That's right.
It's a different government.
But that would be comprised partly of retention of nurses for longer, nurses who otherwise would go out of the system, partly by recruitment, partly by training, and partly by bringing them in from overseas.
Right, okay.
So do you believe that immigration would be good for the area?
I think that you need to have the right sort of immigration. The problem that we've got as members of the EU, as you know, is that there's freedom of movement of labour, which means that people can come into this country from the EU without necessarily having a job available for them. The immigration policy that we've outlined in the manifesto is that people should be encouraged to come into this country to provide services that we need, and for that purpose people will be allotted points on their applications. So, for example, a highly qualified nurse, I would have thought, would certainly qualify to come into this country.
Is this just for the immigration policies around the European countries?
No, for the whole world.
For the whole world. We have got a separate policy on asylum seekers then, haven't we, that is totally different to immigration.
That is completely different.
And we're under the UN treaty, aren't we,
Yeah,
where we have
that's
to take so
this
many
is
asylum
straightforward.
seekers.
Immigration associated with employment.
Right,
So
so the
you do-
asylum seeker policies,
Well,
do you agree that we still should stay with the UN treaty?
Oh, absolutely, and there's no question about that. We will, remain signatories, for example, to the European Declaration, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights.
Human rights, yeah.
No, I think it's important not to confuse the two issues. I mean, on the one hand, you have immigration associated with employment. You've also got the issue of asylum, which is a humanitarian issue.
Does that mean, in general, then you're going to be putting more money into training for these key occupations, and also for the police, and also for teachers, and because over the years this training has dropped down, hasn't it?
I think we need to make sure that we have the level of employment that we need in the important public services, and for that purpose, obviously, we have to put money into it. For example, we've announced that we're going to provide bursaries for trainee nurses, which I think is actually a good policy.
Were they scrapped in 2017 in England?
They were, and
that?
I think that it was recognised that was not right, and they're going to be reintroduced for nurses.
Because Wales kept the bursary, didn't they?
Well, it is going to be reintroduced.
It's going to be reintroduced.
Just a question someone sort of sent in. Someone said that they're on universal credit. They've got into £2,000 worth of debt. They go to food banks. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's very difficult to comment on an individual case, but what I would say is that if there are a constituent at Clwyd West after the election, if I win, they want to come and see me, they're always very welcome to do so.
And what can you actually do about that then?
Well, we can assess we can assess whether or not they're missing an element of the benefit that they should have. We can intervene, and on occasions, and I do this reasonably frequently, we can write to the appropriate authority, including the minister.
And
I think people don't realise, do they, that they can go to their local MP, and I've been to my local MP, and he's been really good at resolving a couple of situations. But you know, it's we have to look at national policy and why people are in this situation as well, don't we? And we need to change policy sometimes.
Well, not necessarily. Sometimes you do. Sometimes it's an issue of the implementation of the policy, and the policy has not been implemented correctly by the relevant agency. We find that reasonably frequently, and you know we're obviously very keen to intervene.
Just a couple of ones to end up,
There's
and before we
give questions that have come in.
Yes,
we did tell audience that we would ask their questions, didn't we? So I've got one from Marion Iron saying, "Can someone ask the Conservative candidates? In 1979, when Margaret Thatcher came into power, she gave everyone the right to buy their council houses. With the money generated from this, they were going to build new council houses to replace the ones that have been sold off. Can you ask what happened to that money, and why did we not..." This is going too far.
Well, it's going back 40 years,
but
frankly.
I suppose we're looking...
You were a young lad, you were a young lad.
Over this one. But I suppose maybe we can sort of link that in with policy today then.
Well, I mean,
for building council houses.
Well, not just council houses, I think social housing generally. I mean, there's a conceptual issue here as to whether council should be doing it or whether housing associations should be doing it. But in any event, we need more social housing. And I think that everybody recognises that, you know, this is an important issue. A lot of strain, of course, is being put upon the housing stock of the country, because, of course, we are attracting such a large number of immigrants, which we, you know...
Are we attracting a large number of immigrants?
Yes.
How many in this area? Have we got lots of data on it?
I'm sure there would be data, but
but you've come out with a statement.
But no. Frankly, I'm talking about the country as a whole. If you actually have a look at a level of inward migration, you do obviously need to maintain housing.
But
can we park that though? Because
we have, because I've worked in that area, and the figures don't back that up.
Well, look, the other issue that we got in Wales is that there are policies which are really inimical to housing development in Wales. For example, I mean, the Welsh Assembly had a policy to increase council house building, and it turned out that last year they built 59 more houses across Wales.
This is recently, isn't it? Because housing was devolved to Wales in 2014, was it?
But no, before
was
that.
Was that 2012?
No. The housing has always been a devolved competence.
Yeah, it has.
But they had they introduced a new policy where they would provide more housing stock, and of course they built 59. Part of the problem is with the planning system, which does need a radical overhaul, both in Wales and in England. But you also need to consider issues such as the freeing up of greenfield sites and so on. It's a big debate, but you know the housing is a massive issue.
But we do need
one question,
housing,
then time for you. Just a question. There's been a lack of honesty in the past in some of the things that have come through, and people are asking, will you be honest? And will you support your transparency? And will you be supporting your constituents, or will you actually vote with the party?
Well, it depends. I don't always vote with the party, but the view that I take is this. No individual is so scintillatingly talented that he or she gets the vote because he is or who he or she is. People usually vote, it's true to say, for a party.
For policies,
and if I were to vote in Parliament regularly, contrary to party policy, people back here would be saying, hang on, we sent you to Westminster as a Conservative, and we expect you to behave as a Conservative.
Okay. In terms of honesty and transparency, because your leader at times has made promises that he hasn't kept.
Name one.
Well, going out of Brexit by the end of October.
And we all know why that was.
Well, I'm saying it was a promise and it didn't happen.
And as a consequence of... sorry, I must finish that.
Okay.
As a consequence of that, he forced the general election that we're having now. Because Parliament would not allow him to get the country out of the EU on the 31st of October, as he wanted, he has forced this election, and now the people have the right to...
There was an issue about a bus and about all this. But back to you for the last...
I'll just say one thing before we go to David.
Can I talk about personal honesty, which is the question?
That's the key.
Look, I've been the MP here now for almost 15 years. I actually think that I have been scrupulously honest with my constituents and transparent. My door is always open. I'm always very, very pleased to see constituents if they want to see me. And if I'm re-elected, that state of affairs will continue.
Okay. Someone's just said the immigrants make a net contribution to the UK and not taking more out.
And furthermore, they will make a bigger contribution when we are not taking all comers, but taking people who want to work.
A couple of minutes why people should vote for you.
Well, I think a lot of people know me already. As I say, I've been the MP here for the last 15 years. I think that I've always done what I said I would do. I live in the constituency. My roots are in the constituency. And my door, as I say, is always open. If people ever need to see me, they can. I think I'm a straight dealer. And I think that if people ever need help, they will find help in me.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very
It's
much.
been great having you on the show, David.
It's gone very, very quickly.
It always does, doesn't it?
Thank you very much for having me.
It does. Okay. Thank you. Let us move
And all
on.
the candidates are so different. You're all like different characters, but also got different sort of strengths in their own areas or weaknesses. And yeah, it's really interesting. It's been a really interesting few weeks.
Yes, and we've got Gavin Scott now, who should be waiting outside.
Yes, I'm going to pop downstairs and I'm going to see if I can see Gavin.
Okay.
And bring him
We'll
up
put our
to-
tune on.
And we'll put any questions to Gavin as well.
Thank you. Thank you.